We are lucky to be joined by an esteemed panel this afternoon to discuss hydraulic fracking. We titled it Groundbreaking, which I think is just a perfect word for this. So first, I'd like to introduce Tisha Connolly-Schuler. She is she's the president and CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And Dr. Richard Learoff, a founder and executive director of the Investor Environmental Health Network. And lastly, Alan Krupnick, the senior fellow and director at the Center for Energy Economics and Policy. All right, let's start.
Boy, you can't see a thing up here.
So, Alan, I'll direct the first question to you, since you're sitting closest to me.
Okay.
So does hydraulic fracking constitute a revolution in energy, or is it more trouble than it's worth?
Well, that's a trade-off I hope we don't have to make. I think it does constitute a revolution in energy. I'm talking mostly about shale gas now, which is these days almost all from hydraulically fractured sources. So there's also tight oil, like in the Bakken, which I'll talk less about. So this has created cheap energy, cheap natural gas for the United States, and caused expectations that we would be importing liquefied natural gas from sources in the Middle East and elsewhere into the United States to turn that around and export natural gas outside. At the same time, it's caused some relocation of foreign firms who use natural gas as a feedstock to come to this country, and it's begun to revitalize our chemical industry. It's also started to, natural gas has started to penetrate into heavy-duty trucking. I know a lot of you are concerned about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and so on from freight. And this is penetrating in railroads and shipping and so on. So that's some of the positive sides. It's also reducing electricity prices. On the negative side, there are risks, and I hope we'll talk about that more while we're sitting here. But my view is that we can sustainably develop our shale gas resources so we don't have to make this either or kinds of trade-off.
Rich, your thoughts on the same question?
I think we don't have to make the trade-offs, and there are folks who would prefer an energy future that is non-fossil. In my work, I don't get into that larger question. The investors who I work with are really concerned about making sure that the natural gas and oil companies that we're invested in do the right thing, that they implement best management practices, that they talk about those practices publicly, and that in fact they bring to bear the best management practices that are out there already and that are rapidly evolving because of technological changes, so as to minimize their footprint. Alan alluded to risks. I thought your first question would be, is hydraulic fracturing safe? Because that's the one I often hear.
Is it?
I reframe the question to, it's a balancing of risks. What are the risks? It's risk-benefit balancing, and it's also an equity question of who's getting the benefits, who's bearing the risks. And some of these, a lot of the risks are technologically manageable. Beyond that, there are community impacts, and there you get into the issue of way of life, industrialization of rural communities, and those kinds of things. And that's why you have all these community debates going on all across the country in terms of whether or not we want it. I think the people who don't want it tend to see the risks as either largely unmanageable or else downplayed by the industry. They're very suspicious of of suggestions that in fact it can be done sustainably or safely.
Tisha, you probably have a little bit of experience with local matters in fracking. What are your thoughts?
Sure. I imagine that most people sitting in the audience today are feeling like observers to a discussion about fracking, but I would argue that this is a conversation that everyone in this room is and should be keenly interested in and engaged in. And the reason is that energy is the cornerstone of everything in our way of life. And in fact, oil and gas, even if we want to frame it as a villain, is at the foundation of our way of life in every possible way. And so we are extraordinarily interdependent on oil and gas resources. So having an engaged, thoughtful, bar-raising conversation about oil and gas development is something that is the reason I came to this event and the reason I imagine that most of you are sitting here. So if you think about all of our water, all of our food, all of our fuel, how we keep our house warm, how the lights here are turned on, this is all happening from an infrastructure of oil and gas development. Around the world, all energy is still 86% fossil fuels. So in that context, then we can go into talking about how do I feel about oil and gas development, and then as a subset, how do I feel about fracking? And although it can be framed as risk balancing, you could also frame it in the context of trade-offs. If energy is the cornerstone of our way of life, and affordable energy is at the key of how we raise people's quality of life, and if you think worldwide that the number one thing you can do to raise people out of poverty is give them access to affordable energy, this becomes a much more intriguing and important discussion. And so do I think that fracking can be done safely? Yes. Do I think we must have engaged, thoughtful conversations? Yes. The number one challenge I see is having a thoughtful conversation where we get rid of the sort of silly paradigms of villains. There's good guys and bad guys. There's new energy and old energy. There's energy. We need it. And we need to have thoughtful, engaged conversations about how to do it. And that's why I'm here today. I'm excited that we have a crowd interested in engaging in that conversation.
Excellent. So let's talk about best practices. One of the great challenges, it seems to me, as someone outside of fracking most of the time, is a lot of lay people look at hydraulic fracturing and say, we don't know what's going into the ground. We don't know what's happening down there. I'll direct this to you, Rich. Should the industry, which is made up of many different pieces, adopt a general, like a best practice, something that's transparent so that people can see what's actually happening?
How many layers of that onion do you want me to peel back in the time?
We'll do one
for us. The industry does have a lot of best management practices available. The American Petroleum Institute has developed a lot of them. I prefer to think of current best management practices because there's just such a huge amount of innovation going on within the industry. Innovation that is not only beneficial for the environment but also benefits the bottom line of companies. And let me just give you a few examples. So there's a lot of companies are now using what are called dual fuel rigs. There's a problem in drilling and hydraulic fracturing. You've got all these engines pushing a lot of stuff down. They run on diesel, and diesel is nasty stuff. Well, they're bringing back all this natural gas. Wouldn't it be very cool if you could power the rigs and the engines with natural gas? Well, lots of companies are doing it. Apache Corporation, one of lots of companies I've got good working relationships with, says they cut their fuel costs 40% on a fracking job in the Granite Wash play out in the western U.S. There are companies that are using solar-powered engines rather than diesel-powered engines to move the sand, or the proppant as it's called, downhole. There's a zero fuel cost. So there are plenty of opportunities out there, recycling and reuse of water. I mean, recycling and reuse consumes energy, that kind of thing. You do the trade-off, but in a lot of cases, it's a lot cheaper for the companies to recycle and reuse on site rather than truck millions of gallons of wastewater far away in 5,000, if you've got millions of gallons, you've got 5,000 gallon trucks, and you're paying all those drivers, and you're destroying the roads in the process. it's almost a no-brainer in a lot of cases that you're going to recycle and reuse your wastewater. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities out there to do things that are better for the environment and also save money in the process. I'll stop there.
So Alan, is transparency an issue? Is this something that the industry needs to more aggressively address, in your opinion?
Yeah, not only the industry, but the regulators as well. Regulation of shale gas development is primarily a state issue at the moment. And we've recently done a study comparing state regulatory behavior in this area. We compared 25 states or actually 27 states through 25 regulations to see how the states behaved. And the fact is there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the way states regulate and in the degree of transparency they have in making data available and making it possible for research groups like ours to figure out what's actually going on. Are the regulations being enforced? Are they being monitored? It's extremely hard to get this kind of data. And so the public, when they look at, there's a BP person here, but when they look at the BP spill, when they look at the lack of transparency that the companies have, although in spite of sometimes their best intentions, and regulatory lack of transparency, it adds up to a lot of mistrust. And I think that that's what's driving both institutions and industry, and I think that's what's driving a lot of this more unbridled activism that needs to be somehow brought in, as Trish was saying, into a discussion where the trust can finally be built up a bit.
So, and I'm going to direct another question to you. You work for Resources for the Future, Alan,
Yeah.
and forgive me, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here. Is natural gas a fuel for the future?
Sure, it's a fuel for the future. Natural gas substituting for coal, for instance, is a good deal for the environment. It's a good deal for workers who die in mining accidents at unacceptable rates. So that's a good deal. It's a good deal because of the prices that now we can get natural gas out of. The big issue about natural gas in our far future, or even our maybe a few decades out future, is its carbon footprint. And maybe I could say just a word.
We will touch on that for sure here just shortly.
Should I just say?
Go right ahead.
So the thing is that the big uncertainty is how much methane, that's the natural gas itself, is leaking out from various places over the value chain. And if methane is a very high powerful greenhouse gas, much more so than CO2. So if you only need a little bit of methane leaking out to make the coal natural gas trade-off not a very favorable one for natural gas. And this is still, in spite of a lot of studies that have come up, it's still an issue that's open. And so in the long term, if we're trying to meet our global warming reduction goals, this is something that has to be nailed down before we can get on, even for the next couple of decades, get on the bandwagon for natural gas.
Well, Tisha, to that point, I read a piece that you wrote about, and in that piece you said that CO2 levels coming from the United States are at 1992 levels now, largely because of the fracking revolution.
CO2.
But this issue of methane leakage is a significant one. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure, I make a few controversial statements that ensure that there's no one that likes my point of view. And one of them is that the oil and gas industry should be aggressively engaging in the discussion of reducing carbon emissions to address climate change. It's the reason I took this job. I don't think you can effectively address carbon emissions in the United States or worldwide without engaging the oil and gas industry. Another argument I make is that those who are passionate about addressing climate change need to make the tent big enough to include the oil and gas industry, because it's a very hostile place to try to work right now. And so the reason that I'm so passionate about this, and it's a bit of a tightrope walk, is because the United States is the only economy in the world that has reduced our carbon emissions and reduced it significantly, thanks for the market-driven conversion of electricity-fired generation from coal to natural gas, purely because natural gas is more abundant and affordable in the United States. If you think about India and China will be buying 93% of the world's coal by 2030. If you think about just that fact alone, it will make you think about how we need to engage in this discussion differently. So I will address carbon emissions within the natural gas chain, but we really do have to think of this on a global scale and contemplate the relevance of natural gas in the face of that kind of consumption of coal in developing countries. And who are we to say that you shouldn't have access to electricity? With that being said, the EPA just put out a rule specifically aimed at addressing air emissions from the oil and gas industry. It's NSPS Quad O. I was in the unique position of testifying in support of it before Congress because a lot of it was based on rules that we put in place voluntarily in Colorado. Addressing emissions from natural gas is very attainable, and Colorado has proven that. There's very simple things you can do, like changing out valves and encouraging the more use of green completions, which is ensuring you're not releasing methane. These are things we're doing in Colorado. They're effective, and they're going into play nationwide thanks to some of EPA's new rules. So a lot of these questions are being addressed, and they will have measurable results. And I can go into much more detail, but then you would all be asleep, so I'll turn it back to you.
I doubt it. I doubt we'd fall asleep with you speaking. So Rich, let's, you're interested in health, right? Okay, so the climate changes. The globe warms up. That's not going to be too good for the world, right?
So I'm told.
Yeah, that's what I hear. But if we have widespread hydraulic fracturing, won't that affect people's groundwater? Won't that impact people's lives in that way?
Boy, again, I'm confronted with how many layers of the onion do I peel back on this one, given how much time we have. So groundwater contamination. There's in the public debate, you have an awful lot. Let me make this general point because I think it's important. In the public debate over fracking, the two sides frequently talk past one another. There is fracking, which is a technical breaking apart of the rock thousands of feet below ground, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. And the state regulators in the industry like to say that there's been no demonstrated evidence of groundwater contamination from fracking. And it seems to be the case that there's very little evidence. It's not zero risk, but I won't go into where the risk might be. The contamination of groundwater and also surface water is more a function of what's happening closer to the surface, how well the drills are being, how well the wells are being drilled. I think there's, maybe Alan will want to jump in on this in a bit. I mean, I think there's generally an expert consensus that if you build the well right, if you use all those BMPs and that kind of thing, put all those multiple layers out there, you put the cement in the right place, you are minimizing the risks of groundwater contamination with a very large proviso that it sometimes can be very, very difficult to protect against human error, like somebody leaving a valve open on a tank and that kind of thing. I mean, stuff happens. There have been spills, there have been blowouts, those kinds of things. Things have not been done right. And I think one of the dilemmas, quite frankly, in the public debate is that the industry got started off on the wrong foot back in 2009 saying, look, you know, I have 60 years of experience doing this, we haven't had any problems. Well, that was sort of your grandfather's fracking in a manner of speaking. Very, very different in magnitude from the fracking that we're talking about now. You know, one of the rare, it was great, George Mitchell is the entrepreneur who basically put fracking on the map through Mitchell Energy and Development. It was very refreshing when he put a piece in, I think in the Washington Post and New York Times the other day that basically said, last year, which basically said, errors have been made and we need stronger regulation. It's very, very rare, it seems to me, for industry folks to get down to that level of saying, hey, you know, we know there are some problems. It was very refreshing to encounter one industry guy who said, look, here's a particular place where the regulations are lacking and where we need strong regulation. The industry needs to get behind that. So not only those of us who have voluntarily taken care of the problem are taking care of that risk, but everybody else is required to take care of the risk to reduce that risk. Sorry for the long answer.
It was an excellent answer. So, Alan, if you would speak to the issue of free riders, you know, in an industry where you have people leading the way who are doing the right thing, but other actors that are not.
Yeah, the industry likes to say that it's the small guys, the mom and pop operations that are more of a problem than the major companies like Shell or Chevron or BP or so on. And I don't really know if that's true. Again, it's an issue of transparency to really be able to get the data to figure out what's actually going on. And that, again, requires cooperation from regulators and industry. If I may, though, I wanted to touch on some of the things that your question about health effects. And I wanted to touch on two very different ones. One is seismic effects, and the other is traffic accidents, so the community level impacts. So on the seismic effects, I don't know how many of you saw Gasland 2 from Josh Fox. That's probably more than anything else what has led this activism against shale gas development. But he did an absolutely unforgivable thing in that movie, which is he linked the seismic impacts from disposing of wastes of the liquid waste in deep injection wells, which have caused some earthquakes equivalent to dropping a carton of milk from your counter to the floor. He linked that to the big one in LA. Really completely irresponsible. So that's one thing. Now, on the other hand, on the community level, no one, except now Resources for the Future, where I am, has tried to actually look at the data to link all this truck traffic. You may need 1,000 or more truck trips to truck water and equipment and chemicals and so on to a site to frack a single well. So there is a lot of truck traffic involved if you can't if you're not recycling or you're not piping it in. And so in Pennsylvania, we have looked at the data very carefully, linking the truck traffic to the shale gas development activity in Pennsylvania over space, over the state, and over time. And our conclusion is that that over the 3 million people that live in areas with significant shale gas development activity, this truck traffic is leading to traffic accidents of about 100 excess accidents a year. And that translates into maybe 12 cases of serious injury and 9 deaths. Nobody before us has looked at this kind of impact, although, of course, it's like any industrial activity. The more activity you have, the more accidents you're going to have. The more traffic, the more accidents. But it's very telling in the lack of understanding of what the risks really are, that this late in the game, there is still totally unplowed research areas where no one actually really knows how large the risks are. So I'm hoping that we can contribute to this debate with this new study we've just done.
That's fascinating. I think we'd all be interested to see that research expanded. It's an important question. I want to talk a little bit about how hydraulic fracturing has changed the social landscape of much of America. Large swaths of South Dakota now have engineers making $250,000 a year, folks without college degrees making over $100,000 a year. It's one of the few places in the American economy where that can happen. In Colorado, you have wells all over the place. How has that changed Colorado?
Sure, I'd like to speak to that and address health effects because I'm sure people are
Sure.
keenly aware of that, and I think we can capture it all. So Colorado has a 100-year history of oil and gas development, and nearly every corner of the state at some point has been touched by oil and gas development because it's something that continues to reinvent itself as technology evolves. Interestingly, in the last few years, we have new areas seeing development that have never seen it before, and they tend to be more urban. And so I really appreciate Alan's remarks because when oil and gas comes into a new community, the concerns that people understandably have are the kind of things that you hear about in the movie Gasland or the kind of things that you're reading about on the internet. The interesting thing is in communities that have 10, 20, 30, 60 years of oil and gas development where everybody has a well on their land, everybody knows someone who works in the industry, those concerns are completely different. There are community concerns, but they have nothing to do with groundwater contamination, with air emissions. The concerns that ultimately affect a community when development is underway relate to traffic, road, and noise. And these are very real, very substantial quality of life issues and very important for the industry to engage in. So the concerns that communities unfamiliar with gas development have are important, they're interesting. We're doing a lot of collaborating on studies in Colorado, particularly around health effects for air emissions because communities are so concerned. But the on-the-ground work that we have to engage with our communities is really, a lot of it is around trucks because there's just reality of road closures, traffic, needing to do routes that don't affect school bus routes, go near schools, things like that. So very important component. With regards to the economic development, Colorado's just one state, obviously, but the oil and gas industry taxes alone contribute what's the equivalent of 15% of our general fund. So this is, when you think of Colorado, you probably don't think first and foremost of oil and gas development, but it's very important. And people that work in the oil and gas industry are living in the communities. So we're raising our families and we're drinking the water and we're breathing the air. And so the idea of this other, oil and gas industry is other, comes back to this idea of vilification of energy providers, which just doesn't make sense in the context of our lives. There are people who demand energy, that's all of us, and there's people who provide it, and we're all working one way or the other to be a part of that equation. And contemplating the oil and gas industry as humans committed to our communities is a way that we can engage more productively in how we have these conversations.
So Rich, okay, so it looks like you guys are in general agreement that gas is probably a net positive, but doesn't the natural gas revolution, doesn't it undermine the green energy efforts? Is that not an important factor here?
Okay, that's an area that I personally haven't been very involved in my advocacy. I mean, I actually should, I'll get back to it in a second. Just as a matter of explanation to the audience, for those of you who don't know what the Investor Environmental Health Network is, we're a group of investors. We manage more than $30 billion in assets. We partner with many billions of dollars in assets more. And for the last 4 years, we own stock in the companies. We've basically been asking the companies, hey, please tell us as investors what the environmental risks are, what the community impacts are of what you're doing, and what steps you're taking to reduce them. Because there is this problem of, the cloud created by the fog, if you will, of the public debate. And we as investors, we've got standard investor concerns, reputational risks, litigation risks, regulatory risks, and similarly on the upside, we don't like hidden risks in our portfolios. On the upside, we like to find those companies which are demonstrating better quality of management by identifying all those areas like green completions and the like, where in fact there's money to be made if you do the right thing and if you do it voluntarily. So we have been talking to it's added up to more than 30 companies now over the last 4 years, basically encouraging them to, we ask them lots of questions about what you're doing, and we try to get them to talk about these things publicly. We've published some guidelines called Extracting the Facts, an investor guide to disclosure of the risks from hydraulic fracturing operations, which I think has gotten a pretty positive reception from lots of folks in the industry, which has gotten some positive feedback from a number of the environmental organizations, which of course prefer regulation rather than voluntary action. And it's been useful to the companies because they have wondered, well, what exactly do you want to know? You know, what are we supposed to be telling people? And we say, well, here's what we want to know about air. Here's what we want to know about water. Here in particular is what we want to know about community impacts. Like, what are the primary community impacts? And what do you do about them? Because it's important for the industry to get the story out. It certainly doesn't help if the industry just speaks in generalities. To your question about natural gas renewables. Certainly within the activist community, they loved natural gas a few years ago. They saw it as a bridge to the future. It's certainly preferable to coal and nukes. And then when the price of gas came down from $11 to around $3 or even below $2, and all of a sudden folks saw, well, wait a second, all this money is going to go into gas. Renewables are no longer competitive. And I think there is a real fear among a lot of people that, in fact, gas will displace investments in renewables. Having said that, the counter-argument is that, in fact, natural gas, and Tisha can make this argument better than I, natural gas renewables go hand in hand because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, and if you've got, in essence, intermittent power, you need some sort of quick backup startup to supplement that, and natural gas turbines are the best way to go.
Alan, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I agree with all these points that Rich just made. I would only add the bigger issue, and I wish some of the activism and the energy that's going into fighting shale gas would go into this, which is we need policies that level the playing field with respect to carbon emissions or even other types of externalities that are caused by energy. The failure of the cap and trade policy in Congress and its lack of really any viable replacement now in the legislature is a real problem. So at Resources for the Future, my colleagues and I have been advocating for carbon taxes. If we had carbon taxes in place at what EPA's social cost of carbon number is, which is about $33 a ton, what that would do is it would advantage renewables. It would advantage nuclear, which to my mind needs a lot of advantaging, and could help us in our global warming issues. It causes other issues, obviously, but it's not something we should totally write off. I mean, the French don't write it off, for God's sake, and they write off all kinds of stuff. And it would further advantage natural gas against coal, but it would disadvantage natural gas against the renewables and give that a boost. So this is the problem of our age, global warming, and to have this sort of side debate about the minutia of shale gas or oil, to me, is missing the boat. That's what we really need to put our energy in.
So Colorado Oil and Gas, what do you guys think about a carbon tax?
Well, let me return first. I'll gather that in the previous question because I too would like to chime in. I think that to return to my opening remarks about framing, the idea that natural gas is displacing renewables is fundamentally the wrong way to be thinking about things. It is, but let's think about energy in this context. What's the most efficient, effective form of energy? And are we investing in the research and development that's going to take us to the next level? There is no solution for transportation fuels or electricity generation right now that's scalable and cost effective and politically viable. If we had one, it would probably look like nuclear, right, on the electricity generation side, and we don't have any alternative on the transportation side that's going to meet the demand of a developing world that's going to increase their demand for energy. They're going to double it. They're going to double the world's demand for energy by 2050. 90% of that is coming from the developing world. So we need to be thinking about what is the most efficient, effective forms of energy that are going to take us forward, and are we investing in the research and development that will get us there? I don't think it exists today. But if it existed in the form of oil and natural gas with no carbon emissions, would you support it? And if you wouldn't, why not? Would you be willing to get rid of all of the existing infrastructure we have for oil and gas, and think of all the pipes and the footprint and all of the associated infrastructure? Think of the mining required, the footprint that would need to be invested for a whole new type of energy. What's the environmental impact of that? What's the carbon impact of that? I think fundamentally we need to become energy agnostic, committed to research and development, and thinking about what are going to be the breakthroughs that take us forward, and what's the total environmental outlay required for that in footprint and efficiency and transportability. And we can't forget about affordability. We're trying to get 1.6 billion people in the world access to affordable energy. And that's before the population grows to 10 billion. These are big questions. They require big answers. So I don't think the question is to carbon tax or not carbon tax in this question. It's to be investing in research and development and investing in an open mind toward what's going to take us to the solutions for an entire planet.
Could I just, the carbon tax is what gets you the incentive for the innovation. Don't forget, it also has your everyday effects on prices of relative prices of energies. But a high carbon tax causes entrepreneurs to figure out ways of reducing carbon in everything that we do. And don't forget about CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, which would allow us to use fossil fuels if we can capture the carbon off of it. That's just left the radar screen. But this is, we may really need to do that. Otherwise, we'll be seeding clouds and, hoping we can cut the effect of CO2 once it gets up in the air.
For the record, I actually went to a conference on seeding clouds on climate issues. It's pretty amazing stuff. Okay, so in the last few minutes we have, I want to talk about the real big, big issue. I mean, we're talking about climate change. That's pretty darn big. Well, let's talk about politics. A preeminent climate scientist that I'm friendly with explained to me last year that if we cut carbon emissions to zero in the United States, because of the amount of coal China is spewing into the air, essentially our efforts would be negated in under 5 years. China is apparently chock full of natural gas, maybe as much as we have, maybe even more. How do you see this technology going international in places like Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe? How is that going to change the landscape for investors, and the world at large? And I'll start with you, Tisha.
Sure, and again, I think we have to be careful not to vilify the developing world as the new carbon problem just because we've all achieved our financial security and quality of life. On the planet today, I mentioned this, 1.7 billion people without access to affordable energy, but energy is the #1 thing that raises quality of life. So it reduces fertility rates, it reduces infant mortality rates, and it increases life expectancy. You want to help people live a decent life, you give them access to affordable energy. So these questions around energy are really complex, and they do not boiled down into a soundbite, especially one as really silly as ban fracking, because ultimately we have a whole planet of people that we need to, that's going to be growing from 7 billion to 10 billion with all the energy growth pretty much happening in the developing world. So natural gas is a huge blessing. It's expected to grow in terms of its influence around the world. The resource is there. What I think is a really important component is what's the R&D happening that's reducing the carbon footprint of natural gas being used. This is an immediate, obvious alternative to coal. Is it the forever solution? I don't think so. I think we're going to have to get to zero emissions. But thinking of tinkering on the edges of US carbon emissions policy is silly if you're not thinking about the energy footprint of the entire planet. And fortunately, we have some huge resources to bring a lot of people out of poverty. I think that's a rallying cry worth contemplating and thinking about how are we going to get energy to these folks and how are we going to do it in the most sustainable way possible, and what's our research and development strategy to adapt to climate change as it's occurring.
I recited a whole bunch of risks that investors worry about. One I forgot to mention is resource constraints. And a major resource constraint on the future of fracking is water availability. So in China, one of the huge fields is under a desert. In the Karoo region of South Africa, where Shell has gotten some concessions, there's not a lot of water. In Argentina, same story. And to the point about innovation, what we see happening already is companies doing a lot of innovation to reduce their demand, particularly for fresh water, because the availability of water is a major constraint to development. I think there are a bunch of things that have come together in the U.S. that have promoted horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, the infrastructure, all the companies. There's a colossal amount of expertise in the U.S. that still has to get exported. The Chinese are trying to buy into the U.S. play to try to get access to that technology. We've got road systems, we've got other things. In all these places, Poland, China, Argentina, you have nowhere near the transportation infrastructure. You have nowhere near the corporate infrastructure that's needed for shale development to occur anytime soon. I think people are looking over a period of 5 to 10 years. In the European Union, you have the question of who owns the mineral rights and what does the national government want with the rights it has control of as compared to the local communities. I mean, we already have bans in France, we already have bans in Bulgaria, and they're all a reflection of this larger debate over can we live with the risks? And I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, Poland is sort of an outlier in terms of welcoming shale gas development, and there have been a number of unsuccessful wells drilled there. I think that shale gas development elsewhere, as abundant as the shale gas is, as you say, there are major, major, major impediments to development over the next 5 to 10 years. I think you've got to look about 10 years out, maybe.
Agree.
Yeah.
Alan, do you have anything to say on the internationalization of fracking technology?
Yeah, well, all the big players who do fracking, Schlumberger being one of the biggest, and there's two others, are already in these countries trying to develop technologies in their exploratory wells that are going to get these wells to produce. But I agree with Rich that the combination of factors in the United States that led to this revolution are not present in really any other countries, because the U.S. is, I think, maybe the only or one of the only that has these mineral rights where at least in some places the owners of the surface rights also own the mineral rights. And that's not a factor in other places. So it does cause problems, although it does cause the ability, if the state owns the mineral rights, then if the state wants to, like in China, they can just come in and say, bring it on. And it's too bad for the people who are living on the top. And this may happen. And I do hear the contrary voices in talking about China, that if the government really sets its mind to it, they could develop these resources. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to be living around there. I was at we did a big conference in Beijing on shale gas development last year. And all of the Ministry of Land and Natural Resources was there, and the Treasury and the NDRC, for those of you that know China. The Ministry of Environmental Protection was not there. Nothing from that side was there. And we know that there are major problems in the ability of the federal and the provincial governments to regulate, to protect the environment. So I'd be nervous of a rapid development in China.
All right, in our very last minutes here, I'd like you guys to just, what do you want this audience to take away? What would you like to say to them before we part? And Tisha, I'll start with you.
So I would invite all of you to join the conversation about responsible energy development in all its forms. I would encourage you to educate yourself. One resource is our website, koga.org, where we try to make every resource available to, if you want to know more about fracking or seismic effects of oil and gas, or how we deal with X or Y or Z, water use, things like that. But really what I think that we all have an obligation to do is change the discourse of difficult conversations to one that's civil, and where compromise is no longer a dirty word, but a mandatory requirement of our engagement. And anything that's a soundbite or has a villain in it, I think we should reject it and insist upon an educated, thoughtful conversation.
I like that.
So for those of you who own stock in oil and gas companies, and you get that big bulky proxy statement every spring, don't just toss it in the garbage. If there's a shareholder resolution in there that says the shareholders request the management produce a report informing the shareholders about their management of environmental risks and community impacts, please check the yes box. And if you're invested in mutual funds, be an investor who says to the mutual fund companies, hey, how are you taking environmental and social considerations into account in your investments? And are you simply passively voting with management when shareholder resolutions come up? Or do you actually look seriously at what the issues are, what the implications are for the value of our investments? And do you sometimes support things like reports to investors on issues like management of fracking risks? Very self-serving closing remark.
That's fine. That's why we do this part,
Yeah.
Alan.
Yeah, mine will be self-serving too, I suppose. There is a lot of uncertainty out there, and there's a lot of misinformation, and I've tried to give that flavor to you a little bit. So you want to at least be open to educating yourselves or thinking about who's giving the information out there in a place like Resources for the Future, where we're a nonprofit, non-advocacy group. We don't take industry money for projects. We have an endowment that gives us considerable independence. We're trying to provide sound and balanced, neutral information on the risks and the regulations, best practices, and so on associated with this big debate. So I'd urge you to look into our website and get our materials, and we'd be happy to come and brief people as the need arises.
Excellent. Well, I want to say thank you to our fantastic panel. I know I learned some important things, and we're lucky to have had you this afternoon, and please join me in thanking our panel.